Hey guys, I'm Joe, and this has been anticipated for quite a long time in my mind, and I'm sure some of you have been waiting for this for a while. But with The Last Jedi on the horizon in the next 2 months, it is now time for me to start my next series of reviews of the original Star Wars trilogy. I've been wanting to do this for quite a while. I meant to do it back in May during the 40th anniversary, but unfortunately I had laryngitis, so I couldn't really talk, so I had to wait a while. And I was also busy doing other reviews over the course of the summer, so I had to wait for the right time to get to it. But without further ado, let's talk about the original Star Wars, where it all began back in 1977, over 40 years ago. 40 years? And we are going to be talking about spoilers. I mean, this movie has been out for 40 years, so I can imagine that most people have seen this by now, but in case some of you haven't, I warned you. If it's any indication, I am a huge Star Wars fan. I love the original trilogy. I love The Force Awakens. Rogue One was alright. The prequels, well, I might save that for another video in the future, but I don't hate them like other Star Wars fans do. I just don't think they're very good overall. But this has been a lifelong obsession, ever since I was 6 or 7 years old, when my dad first showed them to me on VHS tape. And do you guys remember that commercial?
The Star Wars trilogy.
Just playing that in my head, the nostalgia kicked right in. Oh man, this is gonna be fun. And I watched all three more times than I can care to remember. I picked up the special editions as they came out, the 2004 releases, and as you can probably tell, I've had this LEGO First Order TIE Fighter right behind me for the last couple years, and various other Star Wars LEGO sets like the X-Wing fighters, the Y-Wings. I recently bought a Last Jedi LEGO set, the Resistance Pod, and the Millennium Falcon from like 2 years ago for The Force Awakens. This has more or less, yeah, a lifelong obsession. And for a while I took a break from it in my late teen years and early 20s up until I was 22 years old when I finally got back into it, thanks to guys like Hello Greedo. And I can still recall seeing Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith in theaters when they came out. I didn't see Phantom Menace in the theaters when it was released, but my dad took me to see both episodes 2 and 3. And I saw episode 3 twice, first with my dad and second time with my mom. But again, I'll save those 3 movies for a later time. With the original Star Wars, I found this review to be very hard as I was articulating my thoughts, because what else could I say about this movie that hasn't already been said? I mean, it's been said by now by countless people, but as a fan, I do have things to say about this, and while my opinion may not be entirely new in some ways, I'm going to try to provide an original experience for some of you guys, because some of the complaints about Luke Skywalker that I've heard in the last few years, I've been feeling the need to address those, but I'll get to that in a minute. Oh, and just a little quick sidebar here. This past summer at my church where I live, we do an At the Movies thing every summer where we talk about recent releases and try to find the biblical messages in said film. But this church that I'm a part of, each campus location across my state, we decorate the inside of the church with a certain theme for a certain movie. One campus did Indiana Jones, another one did Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. The one church location that I go to, we did Star Wars. And I got to dress up as one of the characters, saying hi to people, getting pictures with them. And we had some other people come in from the 501st Legion to help out and entertain the people that were attending the gatherings. That was quite an experience that I am never gonna forget. But you guys know how popular Star Wars has been for 40 years. It's a pop culture phenomenon. It's practically iconic at this point, so again, it's really hard for me to put into words what hasn't already been said about this film. But as you guys probably know by now, nobody expected this movie to be as good as it was. And I've heard stories of people going to the theater, and when they saw this, they literally were blown away by it. People like J.J. Abrams and Simon Pegg, even director Irvin Kershner, who came onto the project for Empire Strikes Back.
I brought my kid, he was about 12 years old, and suddenly the film starts, and every kid in the audience started screaming.
And the opening for this film begins with the classic opening crawl. Tells you about a war between the Galactic Empire and the Rebel Alliance, and how the Rebel Alliance has acquired the architectural plans for the Death Star, the new superweapon that can destroy an entire planet in one shot. And the Empire is pursuing the Rebels in order to get the plans back and destroy them before the Rebels can get it back to their superiors. I've watched this movie many, many times, and that opening never gets old. It's a perfect way to open it, and the music by John Williams. Do I have to say anything? but I probably will have to. John Williams' music is probably 80% of the reason that these three movies work. As well as The Force Awakens, without his music, I don't think it would have been as memorable as it was. It's adventurous, it's romantic, it's mystical. It's hard to explain really, but John Williams, he's arguably the greatest music composer for film of all time. Home Alone, Harry Potter, Indiana Jones, Superman, Jurassic Park, and even some little themes he did for Minority Report and Saving Private Ryan. The guy's a master. Oh, and also I forgot E.T. That music is great too. So after the opening crawl ends, the camera goes down and you see this desert planet just right below and these two moons, and all of a sudden these two ships appear from off screen. A small rebel ship called a blockade runner, the Tantive 4, being pursued by an Imperial Star Destroyer. Within a few seconds, you learn everything you need to know about this war. The Empire is a huge presence in the galaxy, and the rebels are the underdogs. And eventually they get sucked into the Star Destroyer, and Imperial stormtroopers storm the ship, looking for the plans. Meanwhile, the two droids, C-3PO and R2-D2, are trying to avoid the fight in any way they can. And a certain woman, goes by the name of Princess Leia, slips in the Death Star plans inside R2-D2 in order to get it to a safe location. Again, no matter how many times I watch this opening, every single part of this opening sequence, it's iconic and it's classic. Not just for a Star Wars film, but for a film in general. The stormtroopers exploding through the doors, shooting at the rebels. One of those things where I can imagine that the audience was going like, who the heck are those guys? And then in comes the classic moment of Darth Vader entering the ship. Yeah, you are probably the most evil person in the galaxy right there. And that classic iconic breathing. And James Earl Jones's voice. Perfect. Nobody else could have done that better. And now the actor who was wearing the costume, David Prowse, does a really good job with the stances and the hand movements and everything. But I've seen footage of him actually saying Darth Vader's lines, and David Prowse is from Scotland, and it does not sound good at all.
Start tearing this ship apart piece by piece until you find those tapes. Find the passengers of this vessel. I want them alive. You are part of the Rebel Alliance and a traitor. Take her away.
So James Earl Jones doing the voice made him a whole lot more menacing than he would have been had it been David Prowse doing the lines instead. And not even within just a few seconds, you get a really good sense of what Darth Vader is like.
We intercepted no transmissions. The consular ship. We're on a diplomatic mission.
If this is a consular ship, where is the ambassador?
Commander, tear this ship apart until you found those plans and bring me the passengers. I want them alive!
All that right there tells you that this guy is not messing around. And if you do one small thing wrong that he doesn't like, more than likely, you're gonna die. All the while, C-3PO and R2-D2 escape on the escape pod and crash on the planet Tatooine. While Darth Vader discovers this after interrogating Princess Leia to no avail, sends a team of stormtroopers down to the planet to retrieve the data. Speaking of R2 and 3PO, other people have said this, but this is actually a really cool way to open the film, because you're not introduced to the main character Luke Skywalker until about 15 or 16 minute mark. I do remember feeling this sense of like, what is this place? What are these two droids all about? What the heck are they? What is all this stuff? You learn everything you need to know within the first 20 minutes with these two characters arguing. R2 is very insistent to get this information to some unknown location, and 3PO is not having it. And one thing I've always hated about this, I mean, 3PO and R2 are good friends. Watching it a couple days ago, the way 3PO is so mean to R2-D2, I literally have this feeling of, oh my god, come on! So they split up, and 3PO sees some kind of a transport in the distance, and then it cuts to R2 going through this small desert valley where he gets captured by Jawas, who I think are probably the most annoying creatures you can run into. I don't mean that in a negative way necessarily. And I always wondered, what do those things look like underneath those hoods? I've heard that they look like giant rodents. I don't think I want to see that, actually, now that I mentioned it. But he gets captured by the Jawas, and he gets taken aboard the Sandcrawler that the Jawas use in order to get around and sell certain droids that they have on board. And they eventually make their way to the Owen Lars homestead, where they drop off the droids and put them on sale for the people who live there to buy them. And it's here where you're finally introduced to Luke Skywalker. Even though I've seen this movie many, many times, when you're first introduced to Luke Skywalker, and you hear his Aunt Beru calling out to him, and the music that plays in the background, right at that same moment, I got goosebumps. I got so excited because knowing where this character goes by the end of this trilogy, and knowing where he ended up later on in The Force Awakens, and making me wonder what's going to happen to him in The Last Jedi, I still got excited.
Okay, all right, fine, let's go.
speaking of which, I've heard a lot of people complain about Luke Skywalker in this film, saying that he's just a whiny brat and who's very unsympathetic.
But I was going into Toshi Station to pick up some power converters.
People like Jeremy Johns, who I have a lot of respect for as a reviewer, basically compared Luke Skywalker to Jai Courtney in Terminator Genesis. What? 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 I kind of get why people would say that he's a whiny brat, but here's the thing. This is a classic coming-of-age story. A young boy who is very wide-eyed and very innocent, but has got a really youthful kind of energy, who's longing for adventure. I think Luke is 18 years old at this point, maybe 19, I don't know. And yeah, he is a bit of a whiner, but it's for a reason. He doesn't have the greatest life on Tatooine, and his Uncle Owen doesn't really let him do a whole lot except doing chores around the house. Now, having seen the other movies, we all know why he was trying to keep him from joining the war against the Empire, but still, it's like, come on, Uncle Owen, give the kid just a little bit of free time. Give him some time to hang out with his friends. And I felt like that too sometimes, like Luke, saying, come on, Mom and Dad, just let me have a little bit of free time. I don't want to sit around here and just do chores all the time. And I feel like everybody has been like that at some point in life. They want something better than what they have. You're longing for adventure in order to escape the routine of your boring life. Star Wars has a lot of great characters. Han Solo, who I'll mention in a little bit, Darth Vader, Obi-Wan, Rey, Finn, Kylo Ren, but let's be honest here. Luke Skywalker is the one that we experience the story through. He's the one that started it all. And I feel like in a lot of ways, in fact in many ways, Mark Hamill gets the short end of the stick because he was the heart and soul of this trilogy. And he doesn't really get a lot of credit as Luke Skywalker. I think he does a great job as Luke. And I think when people say they love Star Wars because of Han Solo, who don't get me wrong, I still love Harrison Ford and that character, people who say that are missing a huge detail, because if you were invested in the material in any way, you'd have to have given a damn about Luke Skywalker in the first place. And like I said, it's his whole story of how he's becoming a Jedi and trying to avoid going down the same path that his father did, which made him into Darth Vader. So if you're one of those people who can't stand a little bit of complaining, well, I feel sorry for you, because your tolerance is a lot lower than mine is. And it doesn't really last that long either. It only lasts maybe a couple scenes, because as the film goes along, you see that he becomes a more mature person towards the end when he blows up the Death Star. As he's cleaning R2, he stumbles across a message from Princess Leia where it's on a loop where she constantly says one of the famous lines, "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope." They try to get the rest of the message, but to no avail. He has dinner with his Uncle Owen, where he tries to reason with him, saying, I want to transmit my application to the Imperial Academy this year. But he said, come on, just one more season, and then you can go. Luke, of course, is not happy, and he storms off. And then comes the famous scene, the twin sunset, with the binary sunset theme. This is probably my favorite scene in the whole movie. I had a hard time figuring out which part of this film was my favorite, but I think it's safe to say that this scene is the one. Not to steal from Hello Greedo's quotes or anything, but I agree with him when he said that this is where I think Luke finally makes his choice, that he's going to leave this life behind and to pursue something greater that he feels is out there for him. Now, I mentioned earlier of hearing stories about how people responded to seeing Star Wars for the first time. I really wish that I could be a fly on the wall and seeing how people responded to scenes like the twin sunset theme and hearing the music for the first time, because that binary sunset theme, oh man, it's beautiful. So the next day, Luke and 3PO go off to search for R2-D2, who took off to try to find Obi-Wan Kenobi. And they have an encounter with the Tusken Raiders, the Sand People, which one of them scares Luke into unconsciousness. And I'll never forget, I would always fast forward through this part when Luke is looking through his binoculars trying to find the Sand People down below, and that one Tusken Raider just pops up right in front of him, and 3PO goes, "Wah!" And the Tusken Raider kicks Luke, tries to kill him. That part scared the ever-living out of me as a kid, and I would always fast forward through that. Now it doesn't bother me, but as a kid, still, it freaked me out. But not too long after, when the Tusken Raiders are going through Luke's speeder, this mysterious figure shows up with a certain dragon call, and he scares them away, and R2 is off to the side hiding, looking at what's going on, and then the hooded figure hears R2's sounds, and he pulls off the hood, revealing it to be Alec Guinness, Ben Kenobi, who was mentioned before in some of the previous scenes. And he takes Luke and 3PO and R2 back to his home, and we also learn about his story as well, that he's actually called Obi-Wan Kenobi, the same Obi-Wan that Leia mentioned in her message. And that's another thing I noticed a few months back when I was showing this movie to a friend of mine who had never seen Star Wars before. This movie starts off with a pretty big bang. You're immediately right into the action and you're wondering what the heck's going on, but then when R2 and 3PO get down to Tatooine, the movie kind of slows down for a good maybe 20 minutes or so, but it's not done in a way where you're tapping your foot waiting for something to happen. There's a lot of downtime that's dedicated to introducing us to Luke Skywalker and the planet that he lives on, and introducing us to Obi-Wan and hearing his story about how he was a Jedi Knight fighting in the Clone Wars, and how he tells Luke about the Force, and seeing the various things like the Tusken Raiders, the cantina scene at Mos Eisley. It's surprisingly the right kind of downtime and the right kind of exposition that if it was done in any other way, it probably would have made the movie a little boring to sit through. But it's done in a way where you're still enticed by what's happening. You want to know more about this universe. And it's here where Obi-Wan tells Luke that he knew Luke's father, Anakin, and how he tells him that a young Jedi of Obi-Wan's named Darth Vader turned against him and helped the Empire destroy the Jedi Knights and betrayed and murdered Luke's father, and how he was seduced by the dark side of the Force.
It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us, it penetrates us, it binds the galaxy together.
It's a very simple explanation about the Force. You don't know exactly what it is. Some people have interpreted it as the pantheistic view of God, and I think that's a really fair way to look at it. And I've heard Mark Hamill say in interviews that it was religion's greatest hits in some ways. And it's also when we're first introduced to the lightsaber. It's one of those many things where you're like, what is that? And surprisingly, I've heard Mark Hamill say in interviews that when he first saw the lightsaber, he was very disappointed.
Well, the first time I saw the lightsaber, I was very disappointed because it was a handle with batteries in it with wires, and they'd come in and put a pole on it. Very unimpressive.
But of course, when you see it in the actual film, it looks really good. And it's believable, too. And speaking of that, the effects in this film, you've heard it all before. They look fantastic. And the footage I'm showing you, some of it may be from the special edition, but a lot of it I've tried to find from the original cut of Star Wars. Now, if you haven't noticed, right back there, I have the original film on Blu-ray, but it's the Harmy Despecialized edition of Star Wars. Now, some of you might be wondering, where did you get that? Don't you have to have the special edition or whatever? But I found someone who was selling those copies on eBay, so I got it from there. And I watched it in Blu-ray quality, as best as they could get it. It looked and sounded great. And the effects, save for maybe one or two times, just one or two times, they still hold up 40 years later. The only times where I think the effects are kind of off a little bit is when you see the Star Destroyer flying over Tatooine. There's some slightly awkward bumps in the way the ship moves. I think it's a little obvious that it's a stop motion effect, and the effect of the lightsaber turning on is just slightly awkward as well. Those are just tiny nitpicks. But those two aside, the effects still look great. And I can imagine that still 60 years or 70 years from now, when people go back and watch the original cut, it's still going to look as good as it did back in 1977. Now, people have complained, CGI is ruining movies and everything, and sometimes that is true, but we have a lot of stuff now that can make CGI seem very seamless, that a lot of times you can't really tell that what you're looking at is fake. But the thing about the original trilogy, there was a lot of practical effects that went into this film, like the creatures in the cantina scene, and the actual sets and production design that went into this, the locations. It doesn't feel fake. There's always something going on in the background that can make you feel like you're actually there experiencing it, along with Luke Skywalker and the other characters. Some of these creature designs may be only on screen for like 10 seconds or so. You can tell that a lot of detail went into these things, and I gotta give the designers major props for that. So Obi-Wan manages to uncover the full message that Leia sent to him, and he tries to get Luke to join him on this quest to the planet Alderaan. Luke does want to go for something better than what he has, but he still feels a sense of loyalty to his uncle and aunt, so he's torn on whether or not he actually wants to do what Obi-Wan is asking him to. But later on, we see Obi-Wan and Luke discovering the Sandcrawler, the same Sandcrawler that stopped by at Luke's place, and Luke is able to figure out that they were ambushed by stormtroopers looking for R2 and 3PO, and he realizes that they probably went to his house. Despite Obi-Wan's protests, Luke takes off to see if his aunt and uncle are okay, but he's too late. He jumps out calling out to them, and he sees their charred remains outside the house. And the way he looks away for a second, but then he slowly starts to look at it. It's one of those starting points where his character starts to grow into a more mature person. His entire life is now over. Everything he ever knew is gone. All that he has left is Obi-Wan to teach him how to become a Jedi.
There's nothing for me here now. I want to learn the ways of the Force and become a Jedi like my father.
And as I said earlier, I think Mark Hamill deserves a lot more credit than he gets as Luke, because his acting in this film, and in that moment especially, is very subtle, but it's very authentic, and you feel every single emotion that he feels. Like I said, he's the one that we experience the story through, and that's why he's always been my favorite Star Wars character of all time. I love Han Solo, Darth Vader, Obi-Wan, and I like Leia, and Lando, and Obi-Wan Kenobi, obviously. And even some of the new characters. Go ahead, shoot me. But Luke Skywalker, he's my favorite. And I'm not just saying that because I met Mark Hamill at New York Comic Con, and here's the picture. Yeah, that was pretty awesome. Yeah. Mark Hamill has played other characters before in his career, whether it's live action or voice acting, but he will always be Luke Skywalker to me. Now, to go back a little bit, there's a scene on the Death Star where you see the Imperial officers arguing about whether or not the rebels do have any legitimate information on the Death Star, and then Governor Tarkin, played by the late Peter Cushing, comes in with Darth Vader to reassure them that there will no longer be any forms of rebellion inside the Imperial Senate. And it's another example where you see how dangerous Darth Vader is if you push the wrong buttons on him. This one Imperial officer suggests that they use the power of the Death Star to demonstrate their power. Don't be too proud of this technological terror you've constructed. Don't try to frighten us with your sorcerous ways, Lord Vader. Your sad devotion to that ancient religion does not help you conjure up the stolen data tapes, or giving you enough clairvoyance to find the rebels' hidden fortress.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
But even then, Grand Moff Tarkin tells Vader, hey, leave him alone. Stop it. Yeah, okay. It's nothing like the power of authority that Vader has in Empire, but we'll talk about that in the Empire Strikes Back review. But it shows you just how far he's willing to go if somebody does something or says something that he doesn't like. Oh, by the way, watch the Sam Jackson Darth Vader video where he does the same thing. That video, oh my god, that is freaking hilarious. But back to Obi-Wan and Luke. They arrive at Mos Eisley Spaceport. They're briefly stopped by a couple of stormtroopers hanging around, questioning, hey, how long have you had these droids? About 3 or 4 seasons? They offer for sale if you want them. Obi-Wan uses a Jedi mind trick on the stormtrooper in order to have the stormtrooper, okay, move along. Move along. Another way of showing you just how the Force works, particularly on the weak-minded individuals. And I didn't mention it earlier, but Alec Guinness is really, really good as an older Obi-Wan Kenobi. I like Ewan McGregor in the prequel trilogy, but Alec Guinness has a certain kind of presence in Star Wars that you don't really see too much these days in other films. And I've heard from various people that he was so professional about working on that film, and he probably went through all these bad productions, all these good ones, but wearing this cloak in the blazing desert heat in Tunisia, that is what I call not just professionalism, but dedication to your craft. And then comes the iconic cantina sequence. I have a lot of the Star Wars music on my iPhone, and whenever that particular track comes on, well, most of the time anyway, I just sit back and do this. And they played it a lot at my church during our At the Movie segment. Since we have a cafe inside of our church, it's a mega church, if you will. They did a cantina theme at the cafe that they have, and they played the cantina music. So, it was pretty fitting. And you have all these weird-looking aliens, as I mentioned earlier. You get a good sense of this is like a truck stop or like a crossroads from so many space pirates and smugglers and travelers coming from all over the galaxy. In a lot of ways, it feels like a Western. There's certain types of shady people that are hanging around, and if you cross one of them, you're more than likely going to get hurt. And Obi-Wan warns Luke, just watch your step, this place can be a little rough. Luke goes to the bar, grabs a drink, and this random alien starts bullying him around, and this other guy looks like a human pig or something. You just watch yourself. We're wanted men. I have the death sentence on 12 systems. I'll be careful. You'll be dead. This little one's not worth the effort. Now let me get you something. But of course the guy doesn't listen. He throws Luke to the side. Obi-Wan pulls out his lightsaber and slices the guy's arm off. Everybody looks a little stunned, and they just all go back to their regular business. Like, oh, whatever. Weird. And it's also here where you meet another iconic character of Star Wars, Han Solo, played by Harrison Ford, and his partner in crime, Chewbacca, played by Peter Mayhew. Harrison Ford, the guy's a great actor, one of my all-time favorite actors. You can talk about other films that he's done, like Indiana Jones, or even The President in Air Force One, but in my book, he will always be Han Solo. And I'm really glad that he came back for Force Awakens. If you want to go back and watch my review of Force Awakens, he does a great job as an older Han Solo. And here, he is just as good, if not better. And it's here you learn a little bit about him, too. Like, he's a smuggler who owes this gangster named Jabba the Hutt some cash because he drops a shipment of spice when an Imperial cruiser came by and intercepted him. And Obi-Wan and Luke are trying to get him to give them a ride to the planet Alderaan, and they'll pay him 17,000 credits, which is actually just enough for Han Solo to get out of his debt. And Harrison Ford, as we all know, he's got a really unique sense of humor, and that's not absent in any way in any of these 3 films. Yes, indeed. If it's a fast ship. You've never heard of the Millennium Falcon? Should I have? It's a ship that made the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs. But who's gonna fly it, kid? You? And then when Luke and Obi-Wan go off to sell the speeder, an alien named Greedo shows up, demanding that Han Solo pays him. Even I get bored sometimes. You think I had a choice? You can tell that to Jabba. He may only take your ship. For my dead body. That's the idea. I've been waiting for this for a long time.
Yes, I bet you have.
And I don't really feel like I need to say this, but I feel like I have to. Han shot first. No question. Enough said. And that's just another example that Han Solo means business. And he does not care at all about anybody else but himself. Even though somewhere deep down he does have a heart of gold. So Luke and Obi-Wan sell the speeder, and along with R2 and 3PO, they meet up with Han Solo at his ship, the Millennium Falcon, which is another iconic part of the series, and a pretty awesome ship if you ask me. Despite Luke calling it a piece of junk, the stormtroopers are following behind and they ambush them, and they barely manage to escape from a pair of 2 Imperial Star Destroyers. Another example of how funny Harrison Ford is.
Why didn't you outrun him? I thought you said this thing was fast.
Watch your mouth, kid. You're gonna find yourself floating home.
And then they take off into hyperspace, and then it cuts to the Death Star, about to move in on the planet of Alderaan, Princess Leia's home planet. And speaking of Princess Leia, Carrie Fisher, God rest her soul, she is really good as Princess Leia. Leia, as a character, was never really my favorite. As far as, like, character development is concerned, I think she has the weakest. There's really not much to her. You do learn a little bit about how her father served with Obi-Wan in the Clone Wars, and that she's part of the Imperial Senate, who is secretly a helper for the Rebel Alliance. But that's really it. You don't really know that much else about her. That being said, Carrie Fisher brings a lot of personality to Leia. She believes in what she's doing, and she's willing to do anything to achieve her goal. She's not willing to give up her friends and the Rebel Alliance. Where Grand Moff Tarkin threatens to destroy her home planet if she doesn't tell him where the Rebel base is, she lies and tells them they're on Dantooine. But still, he fires on the planet anyway, destroying it. But then it cuts back to the guys on the Falcon while they're in hyperspace. Luke is doing some training with Obi-Wan using the lightsaber against this probe droid that keeps firing laser blasts at him. Then you see R2 and Chewie playing a little game of chess of some kind, and how R2 is winning, and Han Solo says it's not wise to upset a Wookiee. But sir, nobody worries about upsetting a droid. That's because a droid don't pull people's arms out of their sockets when they lose. Wookiees are known to do that. And it's also here that we learn that Han Solo doesn't really believe in the Force. Hokey religions and ancient weapons are no match for a good blaster at your side, kid.
I've seen a lot of strange stuff, but I've never seen anything to make me believe there's one all-powerful force controlling everything.
Well, 30-some years later, that certainly changed, didn't it? And after Obi-Wan gives Luke this helmet where the blast shield is covering his eyes, he's finally able to get in tune with the Force a little bit after hearing some words of wisdom from Obi-Wan. Your eyes can deceive you. Don't trust them. The guys finally arrive out of hyperspace into a meteor shower, which turns out to be the remains of Alderaan. And then an Imperial TIE fighter zooms by, and they start to chase it, wondering where the heck this thing came from and where the planet of Alderaan is at the same time. And then it turns out that the TIE fighter's heading for the Death Star, but they don't know that it's a Death Star just yet. That's no moon. It's a space station. It's too big to be a space station. And as they get closer, the way John Williams' music starts queuing up, it's that sense of fear and dread that starts building up, and where Luke says,
I have a very bad feeling about this.
Turn the ship around.
Yeah, I think you're right.
It's that feeling of, oh boy, this isn't good. They try to escape, but then they get caught by the Death Star's tractor beam and they get sucked in. And they hide out as the stormtroopers assemble in the hangar to try to investigate what's going on. Luke and Han manage to ambush a couple of stormtroopers and disguise themselves as such. And they enter this control room and try to get a layout of where the tractor beam generator is, so Obi-Wan can shut it down. Now, speaking of the stormtroopers, there's been a lot of commentary over the years that George Lucas took some inspiration from a historical standpoint from the Nazis. Stormtroopers were named after a certain group of German soldiers in the German army in World War II called the Stormtroopers, especially the way their dome-shaped helmets are formed, and Darth Vader's helmet has some similarities to a German army helmet from that time. Imperial officers' uniforms are gray with a soft cap, kind of like what certain German soldiers would wear a soft cap in battle. And there's that stereotypical British accent that you hear from some of these officers, since I think Nazis were portrayed in certain films around that time with British accents. And George Lucas went full-on Nazi in the Indiana Jones films, but this one you can definitely feel a lot of similarities to Nazi Germany, because as far as modern history goes, the Nazis were probably the closest that we ever saw to an empire, because they brought an entire continent down to its knees. And that common theme still echoes in The Force Awakens, with that military rally that you see General Hux saying, "The last day of the Republic!" And that ain't going away anytime soon, especially since World War II was over 70 years ago, and we still have some Nazis out there in the world today, so the effects are still felt by many people, and it could come back at any time. So anyway, as Obi-Wan goes off and says goodbye to Luke, saying, "Stay here, watch over the droids. I gotta do my own thing, you gotta do your own thing," R2 discovers where Princess Leia is being held, and Luke decides to launch a rescue mission to go save her. Han, of course, is not really keen on the idea, because he's more concerned about getting the money, and Luke manages to get him involved by saying, "She's rich. If you were to rescue her, the reward would be what? Well, more wealth than you can imagine." So they take Chewie as their prisoner, they arrive at the detention block, and they start an ambush, and they kill all the Imperial personnel that are there. And Luke goes off to find Princess Leia, and Han Solo tries to stall the guys from coming in, and it's probably one of my favorite moments from Han Solo.
Who is this? What's your operating number?
Boring conversation anyway.
So Luke finds Leia, they try to escape, but then more stormtroopers come in, and they corner the 4 of them inside the hallway. And as they're firing, trying to figure out where to go, Leia discovers a garbage chute in order to lead them out of there. And it's at this point the film has finally gained more momentum. It starts off with a bang, then it slows down, slowly gaining momentum, and from that point on, when they take off from Tatooine, the film never loses momentum.
Wonderful girl! I'm gonna kill her, I'm beginning to like her!
So they fall into the garbage dump. They try to escape, and Han tries to shoot the door, but the laser blast ricochets. And for some reason, I always like it when Mark Hamill starts freaking out. "Will you forget it? I already tried it!" And when he finally gets a hold of 3PO.
We've had some problems. Will you gentlemen listen to me?
I don't know why, but for some reason that always made me laugh. So they're about to get crushed by the trash compactor, but just barely in time, R2 manages to stop it from crushing them. And also to go back a little bit, you guys probably know the scene where the stormtrooper hits his head on the doorway. I never noticed that as a kid until I saw the memes for it online. After I saw that one meme on Facebook where it mentioned it, when I went back and watched the movie and I looked really closely, I thought, oh my god, yeah! And I hope that guy turned out okay, because I can imagine that really hurt. Because apparently that guy had to go to the hospital for that. Yeesh. So Obi-Wan manages to shut down the tractor beam, but Darth Vader has discovered his presence on board and he's searching for him. "If you're right, he must not be allowed to escape. Escape is not his plan. I must face him alone." And Luke, Han, and Leia, and Chewie are trying to make their way back to the ship. And probably the best part of this movie is Han and Leia's dialogue exchanges. "Look, your worshipfulness, let's get one thing straight. I take orders from just one person. Me. It's a wonder you're still alive. Will somebody get this big walking carpet out of my way? No reward is worth this." But again, they run into stormtroopers and the group splits up. Han and Chewie go off in one direction, Luke and Leia go off into the other, to a big gap in a walkway, and where you hear the famous Wilhelm scream. And you could still hear that in some of the Star Wars films, Revenge of the Sith, and even The Force Awakens, but it's not entirely audible, so you gotta listen very closely if you know where the sound is. And even in the video game, Star Wars Bounty Hunter, if you shoot a bad guy that's really close to a ledge of a high vantage point, if he's standing close enough and he falls over, he'll do the scream. So they continue to make their way back to the ship, and Obi-Wan runs into Darth Vader. Still, watching this movie a couple days ago, seeing Darth Vader standing there with his lightsaber turned on and Obi-Wan stopping, realizing that he's got nowhere to go, and the music, and hearing about his background with Darth Vader gave me shivers all over my body. "When I left you, I was but the learner. Now I am the master. Only a master of evil, Darth."
Your powers are weak, old man.
You can't win, Darth. If you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine.
Now, I've heard a lot of people say that this lightsaber fight doesn't hold up well. Well, yeah, it's not the best looking lightsaber battle as opposed to others, like the duels between Luke and Vader in the next 2 films, or even the Darth Maul lightsaber fight in Phantom Menace, or even a lightsaber fight between Rey and Kylo Ren in Force Awakens. But this was the first time that the filmmakers were tackling something like this. They were going into uncharted territory, they had no idea what they were doing. And these are 2 older gentlemen, so they're not going to be jumping and flipping around, doing all these crazy moves in the air to make it more entertaining for the audience. The emotion is still there, and you could feel the history between these 2 characters, especially when Vader says, "You should not have come back." And you see this look on Obi-Wan's face, presumably of regret, knowing that he failed to keep his apprentice from going down a dark path. So Luke and the gang finally manage to get to the Falcon, but Luke sees Obi-Wan fighting Darth Vader. Obi-Wan notices Luke from far away, and the stormtroopers are blocking off his path. He realizes he's got nowhere to run. He holds up his lightsaber, Darth Vader takes a swing, and kills Obi-Wan, much to Luke's horror. The stormtroopers start firing at him, Luke starts firing back in anger, despite Leia and Han saying, "Luke, it's too late, we gotta get out of here." And then he finally hears Obi-Wan's voice saying, "Run, Luke, run." So Luke finally runs, and they take off in the Falcon with complete ease. But then not too long after, the Falcon gets ambushed by a couple of Imperial TIE fighters, not giving Luke enough time to mourn his recent loss. So he and Han both jump into these laser cannons to fire back at the TIE fighters, and this is one of the best action sequences in all the Star Wars films. And the music. Oh, I love the music in this scene. I listen to that sometimes when I'm on the highway, which is a very dangerous thing to do. And George Lucas based this action sequence on stock footage that he found in World War II from US American B-17 bombers firing back at German fighter planes that were attacking them whenever they would go on bombing raids over Germany. They managed to fight off the TIE fighters and they escaped to the forest moon of Yavin 4. But unknowingly, the Imperials planted a tracking device aboard the Millennium Falcon, so therefore the Death Star follows them to discover where the secret base is. So they arrive and they give the plans to the supreme leaders of the Rebel Alliance, and in their briefing they discover that the only way to destroy the Death Star is if they fly down a trench to a certain point where there's a big exhaust port, a hole, which leads directly to the main reactor of the Death Star. One precise hit will set off a chain reaction and destroys the entire station. So Luke, who's already an experienced pilot, joins the fight, but much to Luke's dismay, Han goes off to collect his reward, even though he slightly, deep down, wants to join the fight and help. And then we have the Death Star attack, which, it's great. I love this battle sequence.
Look at the size of that thing.
Cut the shot, Red 2. Accelerate to attack speed.
Now, some of the special edition changes that were thrown in here in this particular sequence, I don't mind those, like Luke having a few words with Biggs' Darklighter before they take off. It provides a decent emotional anchor to when Biggs finally bites the dust on the final trench run. And you hear his name being mentioned before as one of Luke's childhood friends on Tatooine. And then some of the way that the X-Wings and the Y-Wings make these more dynamic twists and turns fighting the TIE fighters in the special edition, I think in some ways it makes it a lot more entertaining. Although I'm not putting down any of the hard work that the production designers put into the Death Star battle, but the CGI effects that they use, I mean, even though you could tell it's added in, it's still in line with the original look, and the entire battle is still there in almost all of its entirety. And I keep mentioning the music, but the music in here makes it all the more exciting. All the while, the Death Star is orbiting the planet Yavin in order to get its sights locked onto the forest moon, which provides that tension that's required in order for the rebels to destroy this thing before it can fire on its base. The first two attempts, they get wiped out by Darth Vader and his TIE Fighter squadron. So it's up to Luke, Wedge Antilles, and Biggs' Darklighter to make the final attempt. Luke goes in for the kill. Wedge takes a hit and he has to leave. Biggs is the only one left behind protecting him, and he gets killed. So Luke turns on his targeting computer to try to lock onto the target, but then he hears the voice of Obi-Wan saying, "Use the Force, Luke." So he decides not to use the targeting computer and use the Force and everything that Obi-Wan taught him in order to fire the torpedo into the exhaust port. Which, by the way, thank you Galen Erso for that exhaust port. Sorry, I had to mention it. But then all of a sudden, it looks to be too late. Darth Vader destroys R2-D2, the Death Star clears the planet and is preparing to fire onto the forest moon. And just as Luke is about to fire, Darth Vader gets his sights locked onto Luke. But then all of a sudden...
What?
Yes! And manages to scare off Darth Vader. Luke refocuses himself, fires the torpedo into the exhaust port, and the whole thing blows up. So satisfying. He arrives back on the base, and everybody's rejoicing, and then Luke and Han are awarded 2 medals for bravery. R2 has been rebuilt, and Chewie's the only one who doesn't get an award. Come on, I know he's a Wookiee, but still, he deserves some credit. And then the film ends. And I'm really glad that they didn't kill off Darth Vader, because even though George Lucas wrote an outline for like 3 films, or so he says, nobody knew that they were going to come back for a sequel, so it made it a lot better having Darth Vader stick around as the main antagonist for the series. And look, say what you will about George Lucas, about where he went after the original 3, but he is the reason why we have Star Wars, so I gotta give the guy props. Obviously, if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't still be talking about Star Wars all these years later. And also, one more thing, I actually like the subtitle A New Hope. I'm not one of those people who stomps their feet saying, "No, it's called Star Wars! It's not called A New Hope." I actually like the title because it's actually very symbolic for the story. You're thrown into this situation where the Empire and the Rebel Alliance are fighting each other, and it doesn't seem like there's any hope left for the Jedi or for the Republic to come back. But there is a new hope. Luke, Han, Leia, Chewie, R2, and 3PO. They are the new hope for the galaxy. So, yeah, I actually like the title, unlike some people. So those are my thoughts on Star Wars A New Hope. Despite a couple of nitpicks here and there, it's a movie that speaks for itself. I will never get tired of watching it. What are your thoughts on the original Star Wars? Do you love it like I do? Like it? Think it's alright? Or do you hate it? I don't see how you can hate it. But whatever your thoughts are, comment below and tell me your thoughts. And stay tuned for my review of Empire Strikes Back. And may the Force be with you.